This incident took place during spring break of my junior year at college. My three best friends, Marcus, Riley, and Thomas, and I decided to go car camping in Colorado. We'd been taking these trips together since our first year, but money was tight that semester, so we opted for dispersed camping rather than paying campground fees. I discovered a location through one of those camping apps that list free sites. It was situated outside of Buena Vista, hidden away on a Forest Service road that seemed endless. The four of us were experienced enough campers by then to know what we were doing. We arrived in the late afternoon and located a clearing beside what appeared to be an old, dried-up creek bed. You could tell water had flowed through there once upon a time. The location was quite isolated. We saw no other campers or even fresh tire tracks. Honestly, it was ideal for the kind of experience we wanted. We pitched our tents in a casual cluster, roughly 15 feet separating each one. There was nothing elaborate about how we arranged them, just wherever the ground seemed level and relatively rock-free. I can't recall what we did that evening. Probably just drank some of the beer we'd brought and played cards. The drive had worn us all out, so we turned in around 11 o'clock, each retreating to our own tent. I slept unusually deeply that night, which was strange for me to begin with, but particularly on a camping trip. Even when I'm in a comfortable bed in a temperature-controlled room, I typically wake multiple times, from being cold, needing to use the bathroom, or whatever else. The point is, I'm an extremely light sleeper. During a camping trip? Forget about it. I'm accustomed to waking at least 3 times. But that night, I felt completely knocked unconscious, as if I'd taken a sleeping pill or something. But what I discovered the next morning would make me question everything. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. Alright, let's dive back in. When I woke the following morning, something immediately felt wrong. I unzipped my tent to get some air. Then I simply froze. I noticed it right away. All 4 of our tents had been relocated. Not roughed up or disturbed by an animal. Actually moved. They were now arranged in a perfect square formation around a pile of stones that absolutely had not been there when we'd gone to sleep. Part of me wondered if I was still dreaming. That's how bizarre and almost unbelievable the scene before me was. Each tent had been repositioned maybe 20 or 30 feet from where we'd originally set them up, but that's not what really disturbed me. The stakes were still perfectly secured in the ground, and nothing inside any tent had been touched. My sleeping bag was exactly as I'd left it. My phone was still connected to my portable charger, and all my gear remained in the same spots. Nothing was missing from my tent, which I verified repeatedly. I thought I was losing my mind. I shouted to wake my friends. Marcus emerged from his tent first, and I didn't need to explain anything. I could see from his expression that he was experiencing the same confusion I was. Riley and Thomas crawled out moments later, and as I watched them survey the campsite, it was identical, the same bewildered reactions. None of us had any memory of what happened. But then Riley mentioned she'd had an incredibly vivid dream about walking through some desert landscape with a lion while someone counted her steps aloud. Marcus immediately chimed in, saying he'd dreamed about being in the military, marching alongside fellow soldiers. Thomas didn't recall dreaming, and neither did I, but we found it peculiar that both Riley and Marcus had eerily similar dreams. The atmosphere between the 4 of us shifted into something I still can't fully explain. The vibe among us was genuinely strange but difficult to articulate. It almost felt like we were reading each other's minds. It's challenging to express, but it truly seemed like we were more interconnected than we'd been the previous night, but in an unsettling way. I remember glancing back and forth between them, trying to identify what I was sensing. The best way I can describe it is like there was a 5th person observing all of us, who was also somehow part of all of us. We examined the campsite more thoroughly, searching for clues or anything that might help us understand what had occurred. Initially, Marcus suggested maybe we'd gotten extremely drunk and forgotten what we'd done. But this theory was demolished in about 5 seconds. We discovered drag marks in the dirt leading from where each tent had originally been positioned to its final location. The strange thing was the drag marks ended about 10 feet short of each tent's ultimate spot, as if someone had dragged them part way, then lifted and carried them the remaining distance. The stone pile in the center was even more bizarre. There were precisely 4 stones, balanced atop one another like some kind of sculpture. It actually would have been attractive if not for the circumstances. Marcus walked over for a closer look, and as he leaned in to examine the top stone, he stumbled and knocked the entire structure over. The stones simply tumbled to the ground. Nothing dramatic happened. For a moment, the 4 of us just stood in silence, staring at the scattered stones. Then everything escalated. At the exact same instant, all 4 of us began hearing this low rumbling sound emanating from somewhere in the distance. It sounded like rocks grinding against each other, not like an earthquake, more like an ancient stone door being forced open. Hearing that sound triggered panic in us, and we all just started packing without even discussing it. Like I said, it felt like we were reading each other's minds. And that extended to our emotions too. I could sense my friends' fear, and I knew they could feel mine. It was deeply unsettling, 10 times more disturbing than it had been just 2 minutes earlier. I don't think I've ever dismantled a campsite so rapidly in my life. Realistically, we were gone in under 5 minutes, but it felt like an eternity in that moment. I'm not going to dwell too much on what happened. I genuinely don't like thinking about that night, and I'm concerned that if I think too deeply about it, it'll transform from being a fever dream that sort of exists in the back of my mind into something more tangible. That was 5 years ago. Now, the 4 of us don't really see each other anymore, but I suppose that's somewhat natural as everyone gets older. Marcus relocated to Denver after graduation. Riley's in graduate school in California, and I believe Thomas moved to Chicago with his girlfriend. We stay in touch, but we've never really discussed that night since. Story 2. The Campground Warning. My name is Derek. This happened last summer when I was 23. My girlfriend Melissa and I had been planning this camping trip for months. Just the 2 of us, no cell service, no distractions. We'd been together for about a year and a half at that point. And honestly, things had gotten a bit stale. Not terrible, just routine. We figured a weekend in the wilderness would benefit our relationship. We selected a spot in the Uhori National Forest in North Carolina. I'd been researching different locations online for weeks, trying to find something that wasn't overcrowded but also wasn't completely isolated. The place I decided on was a campground about 3 miles down a Forest Service road. According to reviews, it had maybe 6 or 7 sites total, and they were fairly spread out. We departed Friday afternoon around 3 o'clock, stopped for supplies at a grocery store near the forest entrance, and arrived at the campground just before sunset. The road getting there was rough, lots of potholes and loose gravel, but my truck managed it fine. When we pulled into the main clearing, I was honestly quite satisfied with my selection. There were a few picnic tables scattered around, several fire rings, and the sites themselves were tucked into the trees enough to provide some privacy. We drove around slowly, examining the different spots. Most were empty, which was good. We passed one site with a blue sedan parked there, but I couldn't see anyone around it. Melissa pointed to a spot at the far end of the campground, right where the road dead-ended into the forest. It had a decent clearing for the tent and was positioned so the trees blocked the view of other campsites. We spent the next hour setting everything up. Melissa is extremely particular about how things are arranged, so I mostly just followed her directions. By the time we finished, darkness was setting in. I got a fire started while Melissa made sandwiches, and for a while, everything felt exactly as it should. We sat there drinking beer, watching the flames, not really discussing anything significant, just existing together, which I think was kind of the objective. Around 10 or so, Melissa went to brush her teeth at the spigot near the picnic tables. That's when I saw him. I stayed by the fire, prodding it with a stick and finishing my beer. That's when I noticed someone standing at the edge of our site, just beyond where the firelight reached. I jumped a little, I won't lie, because I genuinely hadn't heard anyone approach. The guy apologized for startling me and explained he was camped over in the blue sedan and just wanted to introduce himself. His name was Ethan, and he appeared to be about 30. He had this really intense way of maintaining eye contact that made me somewhat uncomfortable, but I obviously wasn't going to mention it. Melissa walked back toward us, and I could tell from her body language she was not pleased with the interruption. Ethan noticed her, turned, and said she'd chosen a good spot, really secluded. He mentioned he was solo camping, trying to get away from people for the weekend, which seemed somewhat contradictory since he was literally standing at our campsite making conversation. And by the way, as soon as Melissa returned, I essentially ceased to exist. This guy Ethan's complete attention was on my girlfriend, which wasn't exactly surprising, but weird as hell. We talked for another minute or two, and by we, I mean he talked at Melissa while she gave him awkward responses, waiting for him to leave. Eventually, I interrupted and told him we wanted to get some sleep because we were waking early, and that prompted him to go. As soon as he walked into the darkness, I noticed he didn't use a flashlight or anything, which I thought was odd. Melissa and I agreed about the strangeness of the whole encounter and decided to try forgetting about it. We stayed up for another hour or so, then extinguished the fire and went to bed. I don't remember falling asleep, but I do remember waking up, and the moment I did, I knew something was terribly wrong. It took me all of 3 seconds to realize I'd woken to voices somewhere in the distance. It sounded like 2 people having a conversation near our campsite. I looked over and saw Melissa fast asleep, and that's when my protective instinct activated. I didn't freeze or cower in the tent. I actually went out to investigate. I unzipped the tent as quietly as possible and poked my head out. The voices stopped almost immediately, as if they'd heard me, even though I thought I was being completely silent. As quickly as I could, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it around our campsite. But whoever had been there had either already left or was farther away than I initially thought. Eventually, I returned inside the tent and tried to fall back asleep. It was a public campground after all. People stay up really late on camping trips, so I didn't think it was anything threatening. I just hoped whoever had been out there got the hint to have their 3 a.m. conversation somewhere far from where I was trying to sleep. I didn't bother mentioning it to Melissa the next morning. I didn't really see the point in stressing her out over nothing. We spent most of the day hiking, which was enjoyable and a decent workout, honestly. As the sun began to set, I went to grab more firewood from a pile we'd made near the truck. That's when I noticed something on the windshield that made my blood run cold. It was a napkin folded in half and tucked under the wiper blade. I pulled it out and unfolded it, and I was shocked to discover it was a note saying, "You should move your tent." I obviously wasn't going to keep that to myself, so I showed Melissa the note and told her what had happened the previous night. When she saw it, she immediately asked if it was Ethan. I said, "I guess so, because who else would it be?" And as we were discussing what to do next, obviously more than a little freaked out, as if on cue, who walks up but Ethan? He was wearing the exact same outfit as the day before, and looking at him filled me with a mixture of rage and fear. The rage won, and I told him he needed to stop just appearing like that, more aggressively than I probably should have. I was 100% convinced he was behind the note and the talking from the night before, and I wasn't going to let him think he was fooling me. He said sorry in a gruff voice and mentioned he was just checking on us. Before I could respond, Melissa asked him why he'd need to check on us, and he actually said something that genuinely surprised me. He told us he didn't want to alarm us, but what he said next changed everything. He said he was surprised to see people as young as we were at the campsite. He explained that there had been a bunch of strange occurrences known to happen around here, disturbing things. He said he'd discovered abandoned campsites deep in the woods, signs of people, belongings, and other bizarre things. I didn't really trust a word he was saying, but he stated it so matter-of-factly that part of me thought he might be genuine. He continued, saying he'd heard people walking around his car the previous night, so he was going to cut his trip short and leave before sunset. Then he advised us to do the same. At that point, I wasn't going to argue, and it's not like Melissa wanted to remain either. So we all started packing our belongings. It was quite stressful since the sun was already almost set to begin with. I could tell Melissa was starting to panic because her hands were trembling as she put things in the car, and I tried my best to calm her down, but I wasn't feeling great about things either. We finally finished loading everything in the car, and I started pulling out without another word. The sun was basically set at that point and would probably be completely dark in a few minutes. But as I was driving out, I noticed something that made me hit the brakes. Ethan's blue sedan was still in his campsite, which I found strange. I saw Ethan crouched down near one of his tires, so I actually stopped my car. I asked him what he was doing, and he stepped back from his vehicle to reveal a massive gash in the tire, something that was definitely done deliberately. There was no question about it. Melissa said, "Holy shit," and I was pretty shocked to see it as well. I didn't know what to do. At first, he asked if I could give him a ride, but Melissa whispered that she wouldn't be comfortable with that. So I told him I couldn't, which led him to ask if I would call the police for him as soon as I got service. I told him I would. I pulled out of the campground and started down the dirt road, my headlights on full blast. We were maybe 100 yards down the road when I glanced to my right and saw something that still haunts me. There were 3 figures standing in the woods, maybe 30 feet off the road. They weren't moving, and it didn't look like they were trying to hide either, almost like they wanted to be seen. I only saw them for a split second, but I was 100% certain they were people. And Melissa noticed them as well. My foot instinctively hit the brake. I don't even know why. Maybe some part of me thought I should go back and warn Ethan, or maybe I was just trying to process what I was seeing. But before I could think it through, Melissa grabbed my arm and screamed at me to drive, like a genuine scream. So I did. Melissa didn't say anything the entire way back to the main highway. As soon as I got service, I pulled over and called 911. I told them everything, and the dispatcher said they'd send someone to check on him. We never heard back from them. I wasn't really expecting to, but I had this sick feeling that something really wrong happened to Ethan and that I was partly to blame. Melissa tried to reassure me that he was in on the whole thing, which is a possibility, but I think that's just a coping mechanism more than anything. Either way, this is still something I think about from time to time. Story 3. The Tally Marks. This happened 2 years ago. I was 28 at the time, working remotely as an IT consultant out of Bozeman. The job wasn't anything special, but it paid decently, and being able to work from anywhere was a huge advantage for me. Unfortunately, I was going through a rough period then. I'd just gotten divorced about 3 months earlier and wasn't handling it well. Nothing I tried was working, and believe me, I tried everything. It seems somewhat foolish and naive looking back, but at one point I was convinced I'd spend the rest of my life in misery unless I did something drastic, like go off the grid and spend a few weeks in the wilderness type drastic. So that's essentially what I did. Camping has always been a significant part of my life, so trekking into the wilderness alone isn't actually as crazy as it sounds, at least for me. I'm a lifelong scout, couldn't quite make Eagle in time, but the point is, I know my way around wilderness better than most. I have my father to thank for that. I didn't want to go anywhere with other people around though. That would have defeated the entire purpose. I needed to be truly alone. So I did what any reasonable person does at 2 a.m. when they can't sleep. I went down an internet rabbit hole. Eventually, I found this old Montana backcountry camping forum with numerous posts about some unofficial sites in the Helena Lewis and Clark National Forest. Right then and there, I made the decision. The next morning, I planned everything out. The only person I told where I was going was my brother, and I didn't even mention the specific spot to him, just a vague description of the general area. I had plenty of PTO saved up, so missing a week or so of work wasn't catastrophic. If I'm remembering correctly, that was a Tuesday, so it must have been Thursday by the time I had my truck fully loaded. I had enough supplies to last the full week and then some freeze-dried meals, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, and all the other essentials. And of course, my Remington 700. I'm not a gun enthusiast or anything, but you don't go that deep into Montana wilderness without protection from wildlife. The drive out there was about 4 hours from Bozeman. The first 3.5 were easy, highway to county road to Forest Service road. That last portion though, what a headache. My GPS kept trying to reroute me because the service road I needed wasn't in its system. After some painful backtracking and double-checking the descriptions from those online posts, I found this overgrown trail that seemed to match what someone had written about. Twice I had to stop to move branches and other debris blocking the path. My truck's a decent 4x4, but I was starting to worry about getting stuck. I drove along the path until it was impossible to continue, at which point I just shut off my engine. I knew I'd have to reverse out when it came time to leave, but I'd been prepared for that, so I wasn't too concerned. As soon as I stepped out of my truck, I was confident I was in the right spot. But what I saw next made me question that decision. That far into the wilderness, there's not really a right spot, since everything's equally remote. Either way, I was pleased. There was a clearing not far from the cluster of trees where I'd parked, and it looked like a perfect place to set up camp. Except there was already a tent there. I noticed it almost immediately. It was this old olive green tent that looked like it was from the 80s. My first thought was that someone else had found those coordinates, but the tent looked like it had been there for years. There was actual mold growing on the surface, visible from 20 feet away kind of mold. I walked over out of curiosity. I probably shouldn't have, but whatever. I called out a friendly hello and waited. There was no response. The zipper was partly open, so I just unzipped it the rest of the way. And let me tell you, the smell in there was absolutely horrific. It smelled like something had died inside. The stench was unbearable. But I was in too deep and too curious to just walk away. I looked around the tent and saw an empty sleeping bag, some soup cans, and a small notebook. I withstood the nastiness just long enough to grab the notebook and pull my head back into fresh air. There wasn't anything else in the tent besides what I'd already mentioned, so I didn't see the need to keep investigating, but something was creating that smell, which I didn't understand. Anyway, after stepping out of the tent, I started flipping through this small notebook and immediately realized what it was. Pages and pages of tally marks. There must have been hundreds of them, all in groups of 7. The last page had 42 groups, which is over 8 months. Someone had been counting something for over 8 months. I wasn't really spooked at that point, more curious and kind of excited to have stumbled upon my own little mystery. But after flipping through the notebook several times, there wasn't really much else to discover. I ended up keeping it. What was I going to do, return it? Anyway, I decided to set up my own camp on the opposite side of the clearing, a decent distance from the tent, but close enough to keep an eye on it. I didn't like the thought of letting it out of my line of sight. As I settled into the spot and familiarized myself with my surroundings, I realized there were no signs that anyone had actually camped here before. I went for a fairly extensive hike and didn't find any old fire rings, trash, trails, footprints, anything that would even marginally suggest another human presence. It was a really clear night. I remember that distinctly because the stars were incredible out there. The drive and setup had exhausted me, so I fell asleep pretty quickly. I woke up randomly in the middle of the night, and I immediately knew something was terribly wrong. I had no idea what time it was, but I knew for certain I hadn't woken up for no reason. I'm a very heavy sleeper, even in the wilderness, so I knew something was wrong. I froze in the dark and listened, trying to hear for an animal or whatever else could have woken me. And after about 30 seconds, I heard it. Whispers. It sounded like 2 or 3 different voices, and if I had to guess, they were maybe 20 feet from my tent. They were having some kind of conversation, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I was so freaked out I started sweating. When you go that deep in the wilderness to be alone, the last thing you're expecting to encounter is another person, let alone multiple people. It doesn't sound like the scariest thing necessarily, but in the moment, I was terrified. I stayed frozen in my sleeping bag, pretending to be asleep. The voices stopped, but I still didn't want to move. And after a few seconds, I started hearing footsteps around my tent, circling like a predator. I realized whoever was out there was circling my tent the way an animal might. Instinctively, my hand went straight to my rifle, which turned out to be the right decision because not 2 seconds later, someone started yanking on my tent zipper. When it didn't budge, thanks to the clips I'd attached, they pulled back. I had my rifle aimed directly at the tent flap, and a very strong part of me wanted to just fire right then. I was expecting the person messing with my tent to just leave, but no. They started scratching the flap like they were trying to cut their way in, and that's what pushed me over the edge. I spoke up, saying I had a gun and to back the fuck off. The scratching stopped immediately. There were a few seconds of complete silence, and then I heard footsteps, multiple sets of footsteps, running away in what sounded like different directions. It sounded like at least 3 people, which was somehow 10 times worse than the thought of it being just 2. They didn't all run the same way, which struck me as strange. I didn't sleep much that night, but I felt very safe with my rifle by my side. As soon as the sun rose, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, making a big show of brandishing my rifle. What I discovered next defied all logic. I immediately looked over at where the old moldy tent had been. It was gone. I walked over to the spot where I knew it had been. There was no ground depression, no stake holes, nothing. The grass wasn't even flattened. But I knew for certain there had been a tent there. I'd stared at it for hours the previous day. What I did find were footprints, bare human footprints, all around my campsite in a rough circle about 20 feet out. There were numerous them, and they were different sizes, which confirmed to me that there had been more than just 2 people out there. Some of them were also really deep, like whoever made them had been standing there for a long time. One set of prints led over to a large pine tree at the edge of the clearing. I walked over, and that's when I saw them. Fresh cuts in the bark. I knew what they were. Tally marks. 7 groups of 7 and the start of an 8th group. Just like the notebook. I just kind of stood there trying to make sense of it. The notebook had been counting something for over 8 months, and now there were fresh marks on this tree right next to my campsite. I didn't want to think about what that meant. It gets much worse though, because as I was backing away from the tree, I noticed something that still makes me sick to think about. There was a dead squirrel hanging from a low branch a few feet away, tied up with what looked like fishing line. I'm not squeamish about dead animals. I'm a hunter for Christ's sake. But something about the way it was positioned made me want to vomit. I didn't need any more indication. I immediately ran back to my campsite and started packing my belongings as fast as I could. I'll admit my hands were actually shaking while I took down my sight, and I was having trouble focusing on the task without looking over my shoulder every few seconds. After what felt like forever, I finally finished packing everything and started jogging toward my truck. I threw everything in, jumped in the truck, and started backing out. Part of me thought my tires were going to be slashed or something, but thankfully my truck was untouched. The path was narrow, and backing out was even harder than pulling in, so the ordeal was torture, absolute hell, but I made it. And I don't think I was followed. By the time I made it back home, I decided I wouldn't even bother calling anyone. I didn't think there was a point. Realistically, what would I even report? It's not like anyone would go that far into the woods to investigate. The thing that disturbs me most is the sight of that squirrel. No one does that unless they're trying to send a message or a threat. I honestly don't know what would have happened if I'd stayed another night or if I hadn't been armed. If this story moved you, hit subscribe with notifications on. And tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from?